Hi everyone, Cassie here from Primrose, and today I'm going to show you how to sew style B of the Dahlia Hipster. Okay, I'm going to begin sewing style B of the Dahlia Hipster. I have all my pieces cut out, and since I'm working with mesh for the contrasting inserts, I've marked the right sides with pins, since on this fabric both the right and wrong side look similar. So the first step is to sew the side seams on the inserts. And the reason style B is sewn a little bit differently than style A is because we have to put elastic along the bottom of the leg opening. And if we were to sew it the same way as style A, we would end up with a seam in the elastic, and that would probably not be very comfortable. So we're going to sew the inserts into one piece. Okay. So I lined up my notches and put them under the foot here. And I'm going to sew with a regular straight stitch. This is a vertical seam on the body, so it doesn't have any stretch going across it. So that means that you can use a regular straight stitch, but you could use a lightning stitch or a narrow zigzag if you didn't feel comfortable using a straight stitch. Okay, so there's one. And I'll be back when I do the other one. Okay, I have both inserts sewn together. I'm going to put those aside, and we're going to move on to step 2 now, and we're going to sew the front and the back right sides together at the side seams. I'm going to still use a straight stitch. Now you're going to want to turn this right side out. You could press open the seam allowances if you want. You could also finish them with your serger if you have a serger, and you could do that for the insert as well. Okay, we're going to move on to step 3 now. We're going to go back to the inserts, and I've gone ahead and cut my leg elastic according to the length on the elastics chart, and we're going to sew it along the bottom here to finish the leg edge. Now since I'm working with mesh here, I'm going to just press both seam allowances to the back side. I have my machine set on a zigzag. I'm using about 3.5 width and 2 length. You're going to want to line up the edge of the elastic with the edge of your fabric, and you'll want to sew in a zigzag kind of across the elastic. You'll want it to line up right to the left edge if it doesn't go all the way across your elastic. And you'll want to stretch the elastic to fit, because it will be just a little bit shorter than your fabric piece. Oops, I just pulled out my pin. You'll want to repeat it for the other side. Got the elastic sewn on the bottom of both of my inset pieces, and now we're going to move on to step 4, which may be the trickiest part. We're going to sew the inset to the front and the back. As you can see, we're going to have a little bit of a curved seam, up here. So we're just going to try and match these points carefully. So I'm going to start with this side, and this one's going to go with it. No, the other one's going to go with it. Yeah. Make sure you get the right one. The longer inset is the back one. So you're going to match the notches. And the side seams. Oops. And this other notch. Okay. Now after it's sewn, so you're going to sew your 1/4 inch seam allowance. Oops. The seam, oops, oh, I need to trim my fabric off, don't I? The seam is going to end with about 1/4 inch of just the fabric folded back here, and that's going to leave you the seam allowance for sewing the gusset later on. Okay. We're going to use a stretch stitch when we sew this seam. I have my machine set to a lightning stitch. Here we go. Oops. There we go. Sometimes it's hard to get started. Coming up on the side seams here, and I'm going to make sure everything's as flat as it can be. It's outrunning over my pin. See how it looks. Oh yeah, see, I have my 1/4 inch. Once that's turned back, let's see how the other side looks. A little bit more. Sometimes it's hard with the elastic. As long as you have enough room to sew the gusset seam, that's good. Let's see how that side seam looks. Oh, pretty good. All right. And You'll want to sew the other side, and then you'll want to press your seam allowances up towards the main part of the body, especially if you've used a sheer fabric like I have right here. And I'll come back once I've sewn the other one. Okay, so I've gone ahead and pressed all the seam allowances towards the center of the body on both the front and the back. Obviously now it's all attached. And as you can see, there's a 1/4 of an inch space for sewing the gusset, which is what we're about to do. Now the instructions say to continue following steps 4 through 8 for style A. So what we're going to do is put both layers of the gusset right sides together, and we're going to sew down the side seams. You can use a straight stitch for this. No stretch occurs across that part of the body here. So go ahead and use your straight stitch and a 1/4 inch seam. Oops. Not quite matching near the bottom there. Okay. Okay, go ahead and do that for the other side. I'll come back once I've sewn the other side, turned it right side out, and pressed it. Okay, so I've turned my gusset right sides out and pressed it. As you can see, there's some little dog ears sticking up here from the seam allowance. Oh, and some threads I didn't trim. So you'll just want to trim those off, make the next step a little bit easier. Oh, maybe there isn't one on that side. Okay. So now we're going to move on to step 5. We are going to attach the gusset. So you're going to take your front and back unit and match the notches. The front gusset seam is the shorter one. Match your notches. Put them right sides together. Actually, I think I want to sew with this side on top. Might be easier to maneuver it if the front and back piece is the top layer. And you'll want to make sure that this part is turned back, the seam allowance is turned towards the inside, and that's what's going to line up with the edge of the gusset here at the 1/4 inch mark. You know, it's not going to match up here. It's going to match where your seam is going to be, and that's going to create a smooth join once you sew it. Then you'll want to do the same thing on the other end. Make sure that the seam allowance is turned towards the center, and you're going to line it up with your 1/4 inch. Oh, see, let me trim my elastic here. That's extending a little bit out. Make sure you're lining up the right part. So where the 1/4 inch seam is going to be. Okay. We're going to sew this with a straight stitch. See how I did. Okay, that makes a pretty smooth join right there. Okay, now you're going to want to repeat the same thing for the back side, and I'll come back once I've done that. Okay, so I've attached the gusset to the front and the back, and the next step would be to finish this seam allowance. You could sew the layers together with some zigzag, or you could put it through the serger, or just grate it by trimming down the seam layers. And You could also, if you want to keep the seam allowance against the front and the back so it's not flapping around, you could add a bar tack on each end, or you could put some top stitching across. I'm not going to do that right now. Those steps are optional. It's a personal preference. And we're going to move on to step 7. Okay, now we're going to work with the waist elastic. This is a piece of waist elastic that I've cut according to the length on the elastics chart. I have it folded in half, and I'm going to sew 1/4 inch seam, just using a regular straight stitch. Make sure it's lined up. My threads. Oops. And now I'm going to open up the seam allowance and sew a bar tack just to make the edges nice and flat, and then I'm going to trim away the excess. So I have it on about 3.5, 1.4. If I make the length too short, I find that the feed dogs don't move it a whole lot. Let's see how this goes. Oops. Still didn't quite move it all the way down, but I think it'll work. Okay, cut all my thread ends here. And I'm going to cut the extra elastic that's sticking out. Okay. And now I'm going to put the 1/4 marking pins, beginning with the seam on one side. Okay, and now I'm going to do the same thing to the waist on the panty, and then I'll come back and we will sew the elastic. Okay, we're now on step 8. I have my 1/4 marking pins in both the elastic and the waist of the panty, and we're going to sew the elastic on. And I like to have the join at one of the side seams, so I'm going to get that lined up. And we're going to sew the elastic on with some zigzag stitching. You want the edge of the elastic to be aligned with the edge of the fabric. And you want your zigzag stitching, if it doesn't cover the whole width of the elastic, to be towards the inner edge. And I'm not going to run over a pin. Oh, let's put the length up to 2. The width of my zigzag, I have it at about 3.5. And as you're sewing, you want to stretch just the elastic slightly so that your 1/4 marking pins meet. The edge is curling out a little bit. Okay. It's getting a little bit stuck on that bowl. There we go. Okay, just stretch the elastic a little bit as you go. I have to experiment a little bit with the width and length of the zigzag that works best on your machine, and also for the elastic that you're using. You always want to make a little test swatch to make sure that the stitches won't snap when it's stretched. Okay, and that's it. We finished sewing style B of the Dahlia Hipster.